Okay, Last Musketeer, chapter 11. And I'll just give you a summary of the chapter before we read it. So the Musketeers are going to the Louvre to try and find a map, a plan of La Mort Triste. Because with that plan, with the map, they're going to try and get Greg's parents out. And the Louvre is the King Louis VIII's chateau in Paris. Okay. Porthos invited Greg, Athos and Aramis to spend the night in his own family's city home, a smaller chateau in the same neighbourhood. Greg was thrilled, happy. Anything besides straw was an improvement, and in Porthos's house he was shown by servants to a soft mattress bed, stuffed with feathers. He fell asleep in an instant. Porthos himself shook Greg awake, shoving an apple into his face. "Eat this, we've got planning to do." Greg sat up, rubbed his eyes, squinting around the room. Aramis and Athos were already up and alert. The sun glared through the window. Greg took a bite of the apple and mustered his thoughts. "Look," he began, "I've no money to repay you, and I know this challenge, has only a slim chance of success. I guess I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know why the three of you would go to such lengths to help me, a stranger, but I'm truly—" "By now, you're not a stranger," Aramis interrupted. "You're a friend." "Besides, this is about right and wrong and defending honour," Athos added. "And it's so much more interesting than anything else I've got going on," Porthos concluded with a wink. Greg found himself grinning. The dread that had been sitting heavy in his heart seemed to lighten, even if only slightly. "Then let's do this," he said. "Porthos has a plan," Aramis said, turning to the chubby boy. "I've been invited to plenty of parties at the palace, so I can find my way around inside," Porthos began. "Once we get in, we'll work our way over to Richelieu's office, which is in the military wing. I assume you've been there?" He looked at Athos. "Only once," Athos said. "I had to register there when I joined the militia." "Ah, yes, the militia." "The militia is like the police, the guards, soldiers." Porthos smiled. "That's where you come in, Athos." "Wait," Greg interjected. "How do we get into the palace in the first place?" "Through the front door." Porthos stared at him as if he were an idiot. "How else would you enter a palace?" "But how?" Greg asked. "Isn't the door guarded?" "Of course. There are 2 soldiers posted there," Porthos said. "And we're supposed to walk right past them?" Greg asked. "Certainly not," Porthos replied. "They lead us in." Greg opened his mouth but decided not to argue. After all, he and Aramis had marched right into the Hôtel de Ville without any advance warning, and they'd gotten every piece of information they needed. Security was a joke in 1615. It wasn't as if there were ID cards or retinal scans or fingerprints or even signatures. People relied on words and appearance, period. Porthos went on to explain that official delegations from all over the civilised world often arrived at the palace, but the guards rarely ever knew who was coming until they got there. In fact, more delegations than usual had been arriving recently as His Majesty King Louis VIII was preparing to marry Princess Anne of Austria. The best any visitor could provide was an official letter from whoever had sent them, marked with an official wax seal. Greg got it. If you wanted to access the palace, you only needed to look the part and to carry an official-looking piece of paper. Porthos could provide it all. Greg had been in such a hurry to escape the Louvre the last time he'd been there, he hadn't really looked at the outside of it. Now, as he approached it with the other 3 boys on Porthos's horses, what he saw astonished him. The building was in the process of being converted from fortress to palace, with 3 stories of scaffolding running along the entire length. Stonemasons swarmed over it like ants. There seemed to be hundreds. The sound of all their hammers banging away at stone could be heard from half a mile away. The main entrance to the palace was almost lost in the scaffolding. It was surprisingly unimpressive, a set of weathered wooden doors with a few crumbling stone steps leading up to them. The entrance to Porthos's home was nicer. 2 soldiers were posted near it, but neither was as attentive as Greg had expected. Both sat in the shade of the scaffolding, obviously bored. One polished his sword on his sleeve, the other appeared to be daydreaming. They didn't appear much older than Greg, and yet they were still soldiers. Greg grew nervous as they came closer, and noticed Aramis did too. "This is never going to work," the cleric said. "We'll end up in La Mort, all right, as prisoners ourselves." "Ye of little faith," Porthos said, with his usual cocky smile. "The more confident we appear, the less they'll question us. Everything will be fine, trust me." "Easy for you to say," Athos grumbled. The plan required him to wear his usual militia uniform, so a soldier's uniform, under the fine silks Porthos had lent him. He was dripping with sweat. Greg, on the other hand, had never felt better in nobleman's clothing, posh clothing. For the first time since he'd arrived in the past, he didn't itch all over. Both he and Aramis were fully costumed in clothes raided from Porthos's wardrobe. Porthos had even tucked a tiny sapphire. That's a small blue, like a blue diamond, a gem, a bijou. Sapphire. In Greg's linen glove for when the time comes to bargain. "Porthos, wait," Aramis cautioned. "If you've been here for parties, won't they recognise you?" "Do you know everyone who comes to Mass on Sundays at Notre Dame?" Porthos asked. Aramis shook his head. "Exactly," Porthos said. "Lots of people come to these parties. Every nobleman for miles around. No one knows who's who. And besides, it's been a few months since I've been here. I've grown a few inches since then." "Yeah, around your waist," Athos muttered. The soldiers at the main entrance snapped to attention when they saw the 4 horsemen nearing. Greg's pulse picked up a notch. "Who approaches the home of His Majesty King Louis VIII?" the first soldier called. The 4 boys dismounted their horses, holding their heads high, as if they were nobility, la noblesse. Porthos marched up the steps and handed the soldier a false letter of introduction. Aramis had written, "I am Lord Vincent from Bordeaux, here to pay my respect to the king." The soldier snapped the wax seal open and glanced at the paper. Greg's heart squeezed. The letter was upside down. But neither soldier noticed. Apparently both were illiterate. They seemed impressed by the look of it, however. "The king has done us great service in Bordeaux," Porthos said. "My family wishes to offer our thanks with this gift." He waved dramatically to Greg, who took the cue. He removed his glove and produced the sapphire, the blue diamond. The soldiers gaped at it with awe, and then nodded approval. The second guard remained to mind the horses, while the first ushered the 4 boys inside. Greg kept the sapphire clutched tightly in his fist. "Is the king expecting you?" the guard asked as the boys followed him through the main hall. "No," Porthos replied. I had other business in Paris and decided to drop by." "You probably won't be able to see him then," the guard said. "The king is a very busy man. But one of his secretaries might be available to meet with you in his stead." Porthos nodded distantly. "Oh, that would be fine." Greg's chest thumped as they marched up the wooden staircase he'd fled from 2 nights before. He tried not to glance up at the chandelier. At the landing, they turned in a different direction. In the rooms that lined this long hall, first attempts were underway at making the Louvre the beautiful building it would ultimately become. Craftsmen and painters were hard at work on a large salon. Carpenters were laying down a new wood floor and sculpting decorations for the walls. Glaziers were installing new windows, and painters were filling the ceiling with white clouds and cherubs, baby angels. The soldier paused in front of a massive double door and waved the foursome to a pair of upholstered benches, a canapé. "Wait here, if you please. I'll alert the king's staff as to your presence." Porthos cleared his throat. "Before you go, my men and I have ridden a long way today and drunk much water. Is there a place for us to go to relieve ourselves?" To do a pee. "There is a privy for guests to the right of the main stairs," the soldier replied. "Ah, I think we can find that," Porthos said. Very well, sir. The soldier exited with their letter of introduction, leaving them alone and unguarded. The moment he was gone, the boys slipped back out the way they'd come. They ought to at least buy us a quarter of an hour, Porthos said with a snicker. Greg had to laugh too. Porthos might have been the first person in history to ever think of the ruse of asking for the bathroom in order to escape. Porthos led the way back down the grand staircase, then through a long stretch of palace that was still unfinished, muddy and rough-hewn. From the smell, it seemed they were close to the stables. Greg guessed he had run over this area 2 nights before. They eventually passed another wide but rickety staircase and arrived in an empty hall. Athos signalled everyone to be on guard. Porthos nodded. "What's going on?" Greg asked. "This is where the militia is headquartered," Athos replied. He pointed towards the lone door at the end of the corridor. "Richelieu's office is right over there." The door to Richelieu's office wasn't locked. There was no lock, and it was deserted. The office was large, with a wooden desk, a high-backed chair and a long row of cabinets along the wall behind it. A framed map of Paris hung on the right wall, facing a framed map of France on the left. Unlike the office door, however, every drawer and cabinet was locked. "This is going to take some time." Greg said, sighing. "Looks like we'll need a sentry, a guard on the door." Athos nodded. He'd peeled off Porthos's clothes, revealing his uniform. True, he'd been kicked out of the militia, but only his superior officer and the men in his unit knew what he looked like. To anyone else, he would simply appear to be a regular soldier. He slipped outside and posted himself in the hall, closing the door behind him. Aramis studied the labels on the cabinets, written in a language neither Greg nor Porthos could understand, but Greg thought it looked like Latin, Aramis stated. "This top drawer, tiroir, holds information related to La Mort." "Stand back." Porthos whipped out his sword and approached the credenza. "What are you doing?" Greg asked, panicked. Porthos didn't answer. He jammed his sword through the narrow slit near the lock and placed his considerable weight on it. The wood splintered and the lock broke. Aramis glared at Porthos. "You've no respect for others' property." "Not when people's lives hang in the balance," Porthos muttered. You remember, they're looking for the map for La Mort Triste, and they've broken the drawer to get in to find the map. Greg opened the cabinet and began rifling through the stacks of parchment paper. The other boys helped, though it still took several minutes to go through it all. There was no map, only lists of those incarcerated, and ominously execution orders. Greg's heart began to pound again. They had squandered precious time. "It's not here," Aramis said, disheartened. "Let's get out while we can." He started for the door. Greg stayed rooted to the spot, however, his mind racing. Why wasn't the map of La Mort in the drawer? Did it even exist? Had it been removed for some reason, or were they just looking in the wrong place? A thought suddenly came to him. We're looking for an architectural plan. Is there a cabinet for those? Aramis pointed at another drawer. There! Porthos quickly thrust his sword into the narrow crack at the top of the drawer, and with a mighty grunt snapped both the lock and his sword into pieces. He cursed under his breath. Greg, on the other hand, felt a surge of hope. Piled in the drawer were stacks of floor pans, exactly what they needed. Greg and the others dug through them quickly, wantonly flinging the rejections aside. It seemed as though every building in Paris was represented. There was an urgent knock at the door. "We need to leave," Athos hissed from the other side. "An entire squad is coming." Aramis and Porthos grabbed stacks of parchment, but Greg stayed put. He was almost through his pile, his fingers flying through the pages. There, at the bottom of the pile, Greg found a page with a jumble of passageways and the heading, Le Labyrinthe de la Mort Triste. "I've got it!" he yelled triumphantly. Athos threw the door open. "Move now!" he shouted. Greg, Athos and Porthos fled from the room to find 12 soldiers, coming down the hall toward them. Greg scrambled after the other boys, heading back toward the front door. As they passed the staircase, they spotted a second group of guards coming, cutting off their escape route. "Upstairs!" Porthos shouted, leading the way. As Greg followed, he noticed another massive candle-laden chandelier hanging above, like the one he'd swung from on the other side of the Louvre. "Athos!" he shouted, pointing to the support rope. "Cut that!" Athos hurled his sword, slicing straight through it. The chandelier plummeted in a blaze of flame and smoke. The soldiers scattered as it smashed to the floor, blocking the stairs. All three boys turned to Greg at the top of the stairwell, impressed. "How'd you ever come up with that?" Aramis gasped. Where I come from, it's kind of a cliché," Greg admitted. "Have you seen it in a film, Andrea or Giselle, where the big chandelier crashes to the ground and people escape?" Below, the soldiers began to clamber over the smashed chandelier. "Come on," Porthos said. He led the boys through a series of zigzagging passageways until he came to a small alcove. There he pressed a panel in the wall and a hidden door slid open. "How did you know about—" Aramis began. "Like I said, I've been to parties here," Porthos replied proudly. Then, hearing the sounds of soldiers charging through the halls, he hustled the boys inside and slammed the door behind them. There was a chorus of high-pitched gasps. The boys spun around to find 12 teenage girls staring at them. Greg's face grew hot. Aramis bowed his head. Athos broke into a huge smile. "Now this is what I call a hiding place."